on this Thursday afternoon. I'm happy to bring to you another speaker from CSGI. I want to say a couple things about CSGI, the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual, before we get started. I've also conveniently put the website up here for those of you who have not been to it. You can check out our events, our upcoming events, our past events. There's actually recordings of past events on there as well. You can also get on our mailing list, and we'd love to have you do that. But so what is CSGI? For those of you who don't know, CSGI exists to study the constitutional, economic, and political foundations of a free and flourishing society. And as part of that mission, we have many different initiatives, but one of our initiatives is to regularly host lectures like this afternoon's, which address enduring questions of our constitutional order, of political philosophy, or contemporary problems in public policy. So we are doing that today, and we're going to go a little bit basic, fundamental. Talk about the role of law, the role of habit, the role of education today. And to do that, we have with us Professor Judd Owen from Emory University in Atlanta. Judd Owen is Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory and the director of a center somewhat similar to ours called the Program on Democracy and Citizenship at Emory. His current research interests are Enlightenment and classical political philosophy, which are of course central to the American founding and to our own political history. He is the author of Religion and the Demise of Liberal Rationalism, Making Religion Safe for Democracy, Transformation from Hobbes to Tocqueville, and he's also co-editor of Religion, the Enlightenment, and the New Global Order. His most recent works are John Locke's Revolution and the Law of Fashion, and Hobbes' State of Nature as a Rationalist Myth. So you can see he studies and writes widely in the history of political philosophy. He also is very interested in religion and morality and how it connects to politics. He is currently writing a book entitled, Are We Prepared to Study Aristotle's Politics? Perhaps in this class, or in this room, we are or are not. He's going to make it a little easier for us, I think, in this talk. But in this book, he's trying to situate Aristotle's political philosophy in the context of his natural science as a whole. And today's talk is drawn from this current work. Right? One thing I think we could say right at the outset, the title of this talk is, Should Education be the First Goal of Legislation? This might seem a little off to us in an age where we talk a lot about value neutrality, or we shouldn't legislate morality. We try to separate these things out. The classic thinkers didn't think you quite could separate these things out. And Professor Owen is going to explain to us in some ways how that is. So please join me in welcoming Judd Owen for Should Education be the First Goal of Legislation?
Mic'd? You can hear me? It's a pleasure to be here in beautiful Colorado Springs. I was just saying that I wish I had booked another day on my trip so I could explore. Now that I see just how gorgeous this place is, you're very fortunate to be here. I'm also very lucky to have the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual here at the University of Colorado Springs. I spent some time looking at the website at past events. It's really an excellent program. It's in excellent hands with Professor Pitts. So yeah, you're very fortunate to have this resource available to you. Looking at the previous talks in this series, it became clear to me that in this talk I am asking the audience to go much further back in time than, so far as I can tell, previous speakers have done. So I want to begin just by making the case to you, or just explaining to you my enthusiasm for Aristotle, going back, 2,400 years, a very different time and place. I have learned, I would say, more from Aristotle than from any other single individual. I have spent the last 3 to 4 years in a deep dive into the nooks and crannies of Aristotle's writings, which are voluminous, and not even all have survived, but what has survived, it's a lot, and it covers a lot. What we have, we think, were materials that he used for his school in Athens, course material, something like this. And it was a wide-ranging education, lots of different topics. There are works in logic, including formal logic. If any of you have taken a class in formal logic, you have certainly encountered Aristotelian logic. He invented formal logic. And he has many other works in what you might call informal logic, dialectic. He claims to be the first person to have systematically laid out the principles of dialectical inquiry, right? How do we reason, have a conversation back and forth to reach an answer? The biggest part of his writings, the biggest section by far, is on natural science, and the biggest part of that, the biggest part of his natural science is biology. And he was also the founder of the systematic study of biology. Ancient natural science was more preoccupied with cosmology, the heavens, and theorizing about the elements, the material underpinnings of things. But for Aristotle, biology is central to natural science. He wrote a major book, large, intimidating, very difficult book on metaphysics, which is still widely read, studied, commented on. One of the still most popular parts of the corpus. He wrote works in ethics and politics. That was my primary training. What I have primarily taught in my career up to this point is the works on ethics and politics. He worked on literary criticism. You get the idea. A wide array of subjects. You never know what you're going to find exploring these nooks and crannies in Aristotle. So let me just take one example to indicate to you why what I think the benefit is of Aristotle. This is an example from a work of his called The Meteorology, which has to be one of the least studied today of his works. And it's a good example for Colorado because it has to do with geology. This is a geologist's playground here. In The Meteorology, Aristotle makes the case that the rivers, the oceans, the mountains that we see, that he saw, have not always been in the same place. That they have moved around, but that it occurs on such a huge time scale that it far surpasses the memory of any human civilization. And moreover, that different parts of the earth undergo a sort of life cycle, where some parts are young and then they're old and then they're reborn and so forth. Now, so far as I'm aware, geologists today agree with all of that. How Aristotle was able to come up with long time geology 2,400 years ago, it's astounding to me. Part of the answer may be Charles Darwin, who was an admirer of Aristotle based on his zoological works, his works on animals, called Aristotle one of the greatest observers in human history. Just an eye for detail and comparison and so forth. And I think that's part of the answer, but I would add to it, it's the deep reasoning based on those observations and guiding those observations. But especially and above all, it was Aristotle's mission to connect everything that he was observing together. All the parts of this corpus, they're not like education that we have today. Different disciplines which are occupied by specialists and subspecialists and sub-subspecialists. And the further you get into your major, the more specialized your training becomes. And so the connection between one part of your education and another is not the job of anyone really at a university anymore. anymore. It's certainly not a job that Emory takes upon itself to help students connect the various parts of their education. Again, it's said that the tendency of our education tends to be toward increasing specialization, especially at the more advanced academic level. But for Aristotle, his observations, he was always trying to put the pieces together in a big, really big, complicated puzzle. As I've been reading Aristotle the last 3 or 4 years, I sometimes felt like I was working on a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and most of the pieces were upside down. All right? But, if you've done jigsaw puzzles, you work the edges, right? You can make progress, slowly progress. So that's kind of where I feel like I am right now, in working on this book. I'm writing a book about the edges. But so again, it's this attempt to connect all the different parts that to me is the most valuable aspect of Aristotle. So whereas I think we today, and this is particularly true in the sciences, the natural sciences, we today surpass Aristotle in many respects, clearly. He didn't have telescopes, he didn't have microscopes, he didn't have satellites with infrared imagery or whatever. He didn't have a whole global network of colleagues working in journals and corresponding and so forth. There's so many advantages that we have in natural science that he didn't have. So we certainly surpass him in many ways, but he surpasses us, I think, in this comprehensive thinking. And besides that, like the geological example, he continues to startle me with how much he was able to see even without these technologies that we have the benefit of today. So like the geology example and the central theme of my talk today, which is habit. There's a lot that our neuroscience today is learning about the neurology, the depth of habit in our daily lives that Aristotle anticipates. But again, and he makes connections to so many other parts of his inquiry, and that's where I want to take us. All right, but, okay, I say habit is the topic, but the title. The title of the talk is, what again, Steve?
Should education be the first goal of legislation?
Yes, that's it. That was just a quiz. I knew it, of course. You asked. All right, but the title comes from Aristotle's major work on politics, known conveniently as the Politics. Now, these weren't his titles. It's the opening line of the last part of the Politics. That's 8 parts, and this is the very opening line of the last Politics, of the last part of the Politics. So in other words, Aristotle concludes his major work on politics with a discussion of education. Education is extremely important. Now what he says specifically, to quote the whole sentence, that the legislator, must make the education of the young his object above all, would be disputed by no one. Okay. The last part of the sentence would be disputed by no one. Can we all agree that this is false? This is obviously false. This is incorrect. The political importance of education, I think, has been rising in political importance in the United States in recent years. But it's highly controversial. And not just the content, although that may be the most controversial aspect of it, but it's controversial to a certain degree whether, or I would say to a considerable degree, whether legislators have any business intruding into the substance of education at all. Now, funding for education, perhaps there's something close to a consensus on that, but not guiding education. Not that education should be a concern at all, let alone the primary concern of legislation. The Constitution makes no mention of education. So this isn't just a recent development. This is somehow part of the United States regime, the regime of the United States. And it was hardly the top concern of any of the new states at the time of the American founding. So the point of view of the American founding clearly reject this contention that education is the first concern of legislation. Okay, but this is not simply a matter of modern politics disagreeing with ancient politics. In fact, Aristotle himself elsewhere complains that there is no place in his time that takes seriously the education of the young in law. Except, he says, Sparta and maybe one or two others. He doesn't enumerate what those one or two other candidates may be. So, in other words, it wasn't, it was highly disputed in Aristotle's time, as in ours, that education should be the primary concern of legislation. It wasn't true in Athens, where Aristotle's school was, where he studied for 30 years with Plato, Plato's academy. I mean, few places on earth have had education like was available in Athens, but it was not the primary concern of Athenian law. Okay, so when Aristotle says no one would dispute this, I am inclined to interpret this, the only way I can think to interpret it, is that he means no one would dispute it on the basis of what he has taught about politics in the book The Politics and in its companion piece, the book we call The Ethics. These are two books that go together. Together, the ethics and the politics comprise his teaching on politics as a whole. Okay, so what has he said that would lead us to conclude, beyond dispute, that the primary importance of education, to conclude the primary importance of education for legislation. All right, ethics and the politics. Let me talk about them just for a second. The ethics. The title refers not to what we commonly mean by ethics. This is one of the challenges of going back to Aristotle. We inherited a lot of language from Aristotle that isn't exactly how he meant it originally. I mean, he doesn't mean things like, there's a life raft, and you've got 10 people, you can only save 7, so what do you do with the old people? Do you save the document? Not that kind of thing. The guiding question of the book about the ethics is, what is happiness? What is happiness for each of us as individuals? What are the components of happiness? What are the activities that constitute happiness? What, in other words, is the best way of life for us individually as human beings? That's the guiding question of the ethics. The politics is the sequel to the ethics, and the theme of the politics is what is the best sort of political society? So the best way of life for us as individuals, the best political society, I guess appropriate for the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual, yes. Now, the ethics and the politics are connected because the best political society, according to Aristotle, is directed to happiness. So we can't answer the question of what the best political society is unless we can answer the question of what human happiness is. And so that's job number 1. Now, laws obviously are an important part of this question. But the key concept that connects these two works, the ethics and the politics, and that connects them to law and education, and connects law and education to one another, the key concept that connects all of this is habit. And habit is the central theme of this talk, after this lengthy introduction. But this is habit in a much deeper sense than we're used to thinking about. All right? So let's talk about habit. What is habit? Let's start with common sense. I think we can actually go a long way with common sense. Another thing I like about Aristotle, he tends to start with common sense. He tends to start with observation, how things appear to us. And then he reasons based on that much more deeply than we tend to do ourselves. But it doesn't start from someplace generally that's obscure and remote. All right, so starting from common sense. I want to propose this as a working start, at least initial definition of habit. Habit is something that we acquire. It's not something that's inborn. And it's acquired through repeated activity. That becomes, over time, automated, so that we don't have to think about it. That's unfair. Just an initial kind of definition or starting point for thinking about habit. Okay, so let's start from some examples. Again, common sense that we would tend to think about as habits. Right? Bedtime. Big time for habits. All right? Go back to your room, you put on your pajamas, brush your teeth, you floss, I hope. You probably floss and brush your teeth in the same order. I don't know what order you do it in, but I bet it's the same order every night without variation. Shower, another good time for a habit. I bet your shower routine is the same every time. Do you start with a shampoo? You don't think about it, right? It's just automated. Coming home from work, right? Sorry, we're just students here. But coming home from work, will you someday go for a walk? Will you pour yourself a drink? Will you open your computer and check personal emails? Will you do TikTok? I don't know. But whatever it is, it's probably just come home and do it automatically, right? Now, habits can be good or bad. So I caught myself not that long ago eating a cookie after lunch. No, sorry, I caught myself having eaten a cookie after lunch. I didn't notice that I got it, and I didn't notice that I ate it. That's not only a bad habit, that's a stupid habit, because if you're going to eat a cookie after lunch, savor it, all right? But that's just an automatic thing. I've stopped eating cookies after lunch, because what's the point? All right. So, these things are automated, we don't think about it. Now, with this working definition, I think we start to find that a lot more falls under the category of habit than initially appears to be the case. So, again, repeated activity leading to some sort of automated behavior that's not innate, that we don't think about. All right, how about learning a musical instrument? You sit down to start to take piano lessons, and you have to think about where your fingers go in what order every time you do it. You're learning the guitar, what is the chord shape, and you have to do it every time. You're learning the new piece, and you have to, the difficult passage, you have to think where are the notes, and and you're thinking everything, and it's hard and difficult. But as you do it repeatedly, it gets easier, right? It becomes automated. It flows more naturally. This, I think, is a form of habit. It includes what we often call muscle memory. But you know, your muscles don't have memory, right? There may be some strengthening that goes on if you repeat your arpeggio again and again, and your hand strengthens. But what makes it automated is happening in your brain. It's in your neurology. And we, and by we, I don't mean me, I guess I mean neuroscientists today that I'm familiar with, are learning a lot, have learned a lot in just the last couple of decades about the physiology of habit. There's a saying in neurology, the term neurology, associated obviously with the cells, the neurons that are the most important cells in your brain. You also have neurons in your gut, by the way. There's a saying that neurons that fire together wire together, and they form neural pathways. Okay? Okay, so when you're doing some activity, okay, you're thinking about how your hands are going to go on the piano, your brain is, your neurons are firing, okay? And in a certain relation to one another. And as you do that, that relation starts to get hardwired, so to speak, okay? So then when you sit down to do it again, that's where the flow wants to go, right? So that's what you're doing. You're laying down these neural pathways in your brain. These are physical pathways in your brain, and that's where the flow wants to go. Now we can override this, right? Things become easier, become automated, but these are the neurological paths of least resistance. And again, these are not inborn, these are acquired through activity. All right, another example of habit that we wouldn't ordinarily think about as habit. Again, thinking not inborn, coming through repetition, becomes automatic, so you don't have to think about it. Language. Right? You're learning a new language. You've got to translate. You've got to think about everything. What word corresponds to what? What's the grammar? How do I conjugate this? Right? It's a lot of effort, but at some point, if through repetition, you become, what's the word? Fluid, right? It flows. It becomes easier. It becomes more natural. It becomes more automated. So that, obviously, we weren't born speaking language, we acquired it, but when you're fluid, you don't think about these things. It comes out somehow. And so when you start to think about, again, how many activities in our lives are automated in this way, starting from earliest childhood, you can also see how useful this is. I mean, my goodness, if we had to think about, even walking, right? I mean, these are things that children have to learn through doing. If you had to think through everything that you do every day from scratch, that would be debilitating. So thank goodness we can automate the things that we do all the time, right? This is an extremely useful capacity that we have. One of the authors, modern authors, contemporary authors, that I've been reading on this subject is a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California named Wendy Wood. And she's written a book called Good Habits, Bad Habits, which I recommend to everyone. It not only, it's written for a general audience, it's not only, goes into a lot of the findings of her research. She's been researching this a long time, but also part of the research is directed toward how to improve your habits, how to think about techniques for developing the habits that you want to have, identifying what's habit that you didn't realize was habit, and then to work on it. Very useful book. She calls habit our hidden self. So I think part of what is going on here, there are habits that we easily identify as habits, that we think about as brushing your teeth, or turning on your turn signal, or what have you, right? Putting on your seatbelt. But the ones that we can easily identify, that we think about habits, as habits, are not as deeply ingrained, not as fully automated as the ones we don't think about. So it's somehow in the nature of habit that it becomes hidden to us. The more deeply ingrained a habit, the more hidden it is from us. Now, back to Aristotle. Aristotle agrees, habit is not nature. He says you can't throw a stone up repeatedly and habituate it to fall. Not the nature of stones to do that. But habit can become, and this is an interesting phrase that he uses, and I found this in another one of these obscure nooks and crannies in his works. In his work on memory, he considers memory a habit, by the way. Again, something you acquire, you can repeat, right, to remember, and something that gets ingrained. Even memory is a sort of habit, right? indication that he gets how deep it goes. But he says habit, it's not nature, but it can become nature. And I think what he means by that is maybe closer to our phrase, second nature. It becomes second nature. Right? It's not primary nature, that's what you're born with. But it's what you acquire that becomes automated. And the second nature, when it becomes automated, I would guess it's difficult. I mean, if it's really deeply ingrained, it's difficult and maybe impossible then at that point to sort out what is my nature and what have I acquired by habit. It's a puzzle of self-knowledge. Now, Aristotle's most important discussion of habit comes in the Ethics. This is the book whose guiding question is happiness. Okay, so if that's the guiding question, why does he call it ethics? All right, well, again, what does he mean by ethics? The title in Greek is ethike. It comes from the word ethos, which I guess in English we say ethos, which translates as character. So, meaning, you know, what is your character? So, for example, are you talkative or quiet? When you go into a new situation, do you tend to talk a lot? Do you tend to be quiet? Are you generous? Or are you on the stingy side? Are you somewhere in between? Are you moderate with food and drink? Or are you indulgent with food and drink? Are you an anxious person? Are you easygoing? And so forth. Right? These are the things that he has in mind with character, by character. And what he says there is that character, ethos, he actually makes a bit of a, I was going to say nerdy. Does it make sense to refer to Aristotle as a nerd? I guess if anyone is a nerd, Aristotle's a nerd. Etymological connection, that the word ethos in Greek, he says, comes from ethos. In other words, you just change the long E to an E. Ethos means habit. So the word for character is derived from the word for habit. He says this is not coincidence. Because character is primarily a matter of habituation. So again, all these character traits that we have, he thinks have been largely, if not entirely, we do have different natures, different proclivities, but again, it's hard to sort out at a certain point, largely habituated into us. And so the central theme of this book of his on happiness, individual happiness, is character, not as inborn, but as acquired through repeated action, or as he often puts it, training. Habit in this deep and often hidden sense. That's where he chose to name this book on happiness. So apparently he thinks it's extremely important to consider when we consider our own happiness. Okay, so let me unpack this a bit. Let me unpack it with a brief sketch of Aristotle's account of the soul. This is another term where we are likely to have a lot of connotations attached to soul. The Greek is psyche, from which we get psychology and so forth, psyche, that aren't shared with Aristotle. So soul for Aristotle is not some spiritual substance that outlives us after we die. It's better to think about soul as whatever the various functions of a living being are, sort of life functions. So any living being, plant, animal, has some life functions. While it's alive, it's growing, whatever it does, withering, processing nutrition. These are all activities of soul, as Aristotle defines it. For human beings, there are three main levels of soul. The lowest level is what we share, he says, with plants and all other animals. All living beings have this level of soul. So nutrition, the distribution of the nutrition, the growth, and so forth. This level, this activity of our soul is unconnected to our reason. We can't think about our nails growing or not. We can't tell our nails not to grow, right? We can't manage our digestion in this way. Unconnected to reason. Plants don't have reason. The highest is the one associated with reason, our conscious thought, our rational selves. This is what he thinks is most us. The middle level is the one we're focused on here. The middle level is the level of the passions, fear and anger, for example, as well as desire. And it's this level that is shared with at least certain other animals, not with plants. Maybe that's one indication of how it's in the middle. Human beings have the rational that's most highly developed. The lowest we share with all other living beings, including plants. The middle we don't share with plants, but we share with certain other animals. Okay? But the key here is passions and desires. And whereas the lowest, our plant soul, it goes our vegetative soul sometimes, is not, the lowest is not at all rational. This middle part is not in itself rational, but it can sometimes be governed by reason. So, maybe something happens and our anger kind of rises in us, our passion rises in us, and we decide not to strike, right? We're inclined to strike, but we decide not to strike. Our reason can control that. Or we're in a moment of fear, and our reason says, don't run. Either because our comrades in arms are counting on me to help fight and defend, or because our reason has said, there's really nothing there to be afraid of. It was irrational. All right? So reason can govern, but not always. Right? We all know that passion can get the better of our reason pretty frequently. And in any case, even when we tell ourselves, okay, don't run because we're afraid, it's not like, if there's nothing to be afraid of, it's not like knowing there's nothing to be afraid of, our emotion just switches off like a light switch, right? So again, this middle part of our souls, the part that we share with animals, is kind of connected to reason, but kind of not. This is another way in which it's in the middle. And this middle realm is the realm of character, according to Aristotle. This is what I think about as your mammal brain or your dog brain. Okay? You have a dog brain, sorry to tell you. It's in the middle, it's the one that has to do with character, ethike. Now, each of these levels, Aristotle says, can be in a good or bad condition. The good condition he calls generally virtue, the bad condition vice. So your digestion just isn't working right. He's willing to call that a vice in a sense, right? It's just not functional. Good digestion, virtue. With regard to your reason, your rational capacities, right? How well you think through problem solving, math, even just your prudence, your practical reasoning, your decision making in terms of your bank accounts or whatever, right? That kind of rationality, that can function at various levels. When it's functioning well, that's virtue, intellectual virtue, he calls it. That's the virtue of the highest and the lowest parts. The virtue of this middle part, the part related to passions and desires, this is the virtue of character. Ethike. And this, to repeat, is, yes, partly inborn or natural, but most importantly, and certainly practically most importantly, it is the result, to a large degree, of habit. I say practically most important because if the inborn part, there's nothing really we can do about that, but the habitual part, there is something we can do about that. So, the biggest factor in our character, according to Aristotle, is what has been acquired through repetition and become automated. It's become second nature. Now, this claim of Aristotle's has a number of extremely important implications. First of all, habits are generally maintained by doing, by maintaining them. If you haven't played that piano piece in a while, it doesn't come right back to you the same way it did when you were playing it every day. It's not so fluid, it's not easy, right? We say we get rusty. And Aristotle thinks that our moral virtue works this way too. The virtue of our character works this way too. We maintain it by doing it. We can get rusty in these characteristics. Secondly, we can and we should work on developing and improving our character. It's not set in stone. It's not easy to improve your character. Just like it's not easy to learn a new language or to learn a new instrument, particularly when you're older. But that's possible. People do it all the time. And it is potentially much more rewarding than either of those activities to the extent that our character is inextricably bound to our happiness. And bear in mind that, as with such things, the training gets easier as it goes. Aristotle says that when it comes to pleasure, through this habitual training, that these activities of our character become either more pleasant or at least less painful. Fourth implication, and this is now coming back to the title of the talk. The most important habituation happens in early childhood. Let's see, I think I left my book. I was going to read something in my bag. I have it in my bag, otherwise I'm going to paraphrase. Forgot my props. There it is. Okay. This is Book 2, Chapter 2 of Aristotle's Ethics. Hence, we must make our activities be of a certain quality, for the characteristics correspond to the difference among the activities. The point he's making here, you can think of this a bit like the learning the piano example. My children's piano teacher would tell them, be careful how you practice. You practice slow to get it right, don't practice fast. Practicing the wrong thing is going to get ingrained. It's going to be that much harder to play it right. It's a similar point here. Be careful what you do habitually because it will become ingrained in you. So we must make our activities of a certain quality for the characteristics correspond to the differences among the activities. It makes no small difference then whether one is habituated in this way or that way straight from childhood. But a very great difference. Or rather, the whole difference. It's a very strong statement from Aristotle on the importance of this habituation from childhood. So again, think about learning a language, for example, or a musical instrument. These things get harder as we age. Aristotle speaks about sometimes of our soul as being like wax that can receive an imprint. This is, I think, an image that also applies to habituation, right? Something that's acquired that gets kind of stamped on it. But, he says, like wax, it receives the imprint most easily when the wax is soft and pliable when it's young and fresh. As it ages, it hardens and becomes less malleable. He says our souls are like that. Okay? So, we age, we get stuck in our ways. We can still work on ourselves, but it gets harder, like learning a new language and learning a new musical instrument. It's doable, but it's tough. Okay, now, finally, we have arrived back to the question of education and law. So when Aristotle speaks of education as a primary object of legislation, this is what he means above all. Education, for Aristotle, is twofold. It's, on the one hand, use of our reason, through reading, through lectures, and so forth, but it is also the development of our character. And the development of our character precedes in crucial ways and is more fundamental than the use of our reason. So we tend to think of education generally today, I think, as what we learn by thinking, and this is indeed for Aristotle the peak of education. This is the education of our human brain, the highest functions of our soul, what Aristotle considered the most divine part of ourselves. But we can't be receptive to this highest and best sort of education, he says, unless our passions and desires are properly trained. That is, we can't properly exercise the highest faculties without the virtue of character. The virtue of character, moreover, is of the greatest importance as social virtue for our living together. Some of his examples of virtue of character: moderation, courage, generosity, justice, truthfulness. These are obviously not only important, some of them not even primarily important with a view to our own happiness, but with a view to the happiness that we have through social life, or necessary for social life. And in fact, it's especially for this reason, for the social necessity of these virtues of character, that the legislator needs to take account of and prioritize virtues of character. And that means to be mindful of, crucially mindful of, the sorts of habituation, what activities occur straight from childhood, directing this habituation early. So consider, for example, not just an example, the moral formation of children. So your parents will know what I'm talking about. Those of you who have been children will know what I'm talking about. We give rules to our children. They come with sanctions. All right, maybe rewards. There will be punishments. Our goal, I think, is for whatever it is that we are trying to get them to do with these sanctions, our goal is for those behaviors to become internalized. Not that we need to continually have the sanctions forever and ever, right? But our goal is that the sanctions get them in the habit. And we wouldn't think about it this way, but Aristotle is helping us to see that this is what we're doing. We're habituating our children through repetition of behavior for something to become automated, so that what at first is difficult and painful, like learning a new musical instrument, becomes easier, more fluid, and even pleasant. Now, you know what? That reminds me that I skipped one of, skipped a few minutes, that happens. Another important implication of this, understanding of habit, is that habit, according to Aristotle, is not self-control. And virtues of character are not primarily a matter of self-control. Self-control is necessary. You need self-control in life, no doubt about it. But self-control is when you are battling something in yourself. When you are having to use your reason to tamp down your passions. When you need self-control, that, you could say, is your signal that you need to work on your habituation. You need to habituate your passions in such a way that you don't need the self-control. Just like we do with our children, right? Their sanctions are there so that it becomes internalized and it becomes easier and pleasant for them. Not painful screaming, why are you doing this to me? Why are you making my life miserable? It won't be making their life, their life will be better. Right? That's why we're doing it, we hope, to make their life better. That we need to do this with ourselves. It's not a matter of self-control. And Wendy Wood's book, by the way, is very good on this topic. Another reason to recommend it. Okay, now, on the importance, then, to get back to this importance of law with regard to education and the training of character. Let me read from the last book of Aristotle's Ethics. This is book 10, chapter 9. very last chapter. So there must be an underlying character that is somehow appropriate for virtue, one that feels affection for the noble and disgust at the shameful. To obtain from childhood a correct upbringing with a view to virtue is difficult for someone not reared under laws of the requisite sort. All right, so here we can think about those rules that we give to our children, or that you got presumably from your parents, with some sanctions that they wanted to internalize in you that we want to internalize. We can think about those as the stand-in here for laws. Right? Hence, by means of laws, the rearing and the regular practices involved must have already been put into proper place. For once these become habitual, they will not be painful. And in like manner, it is not sufficient if people, when they are young, attain the correct rearing and care. Rather, once they have reached adulthood, they must make a practice of these things and thus be habituated. And for these matters, indeed, for life as a whole generally, we need laws. All right, so part of his critique here, part of his claim, is, what's his criticism of most places, apart from perhaps Sparta and one or two others? He says that this is vitally important for the happiness of the citizen, vitally important for our happiness, and vitally important for the happiness of the society, that people have these virtues of character, social virtues as well as personal virtues. But most places, he says, just leave it to parents to do however they see fit. And this, according to Aristotle, is not taking the foundational importance of habituation and character with sufficient seriousness. So, the importance of habit for virtue, for the virtue of our character, and the importance of the virtue of our character for the good use of our reason, the importance of the virtue of our character for our happiness, the importance of the virtue of character for the happiness of the society in which we live. On this basis, back to my title, no one, Aristotle says, would dispute that education of the young should be the primary job of good legislation. I guess this whole talk has been just explaining my titles. The education of habit as the foundation of a good life and a good society. All right, I want to conclude like this, by pointing out that this claim of Aristotle's about the primacy of education of the young for legislation, this comment occurs in the context of his discussion of the best regime, what we might call the ideal regime. But he sometimes says the regime that one would pray for. But the best regime, he makes clear, is unlikely ever to come into existence. He says that all existing regimes that he is aware of fall short, and most fall far short. But he did not think that it followed that the virtue of character can't exist in flawed regimes. It did exist in flawed regimes. And remember, Athens didn't rise to that level, but there was virtue of character in Athens. And a genuine education of the mind, as in his own school, the flawed city of Athens, remains possible. And happiness remains possible in regimes other than the flawed, other than the best one. Not everything depends on the best regime and wise legislation. And for that, I say we can thank our lucky stars.
Okay, so we have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. We're not going to use a microphone, so please speak up. And I'm just going to let Professor Owen choose on people as they have a question.